movies for black girl nerds.
Hey Flavia, how you doing?
Hello, how are you? Nice to meet you, Ryan.
Nice to meet you too. Love you playing Victor. So many questions here. Did you think when you started that you're going to play in a diver that's chasing around his son on a motorcycle? And actually, do you ride a motorcycle?
You know, I could barely ride a motorcycle. I had to learn how to do that to play Victor. So I took some classes and I had to learn how to drive a motorcycle. And it was not a simple one. But of course, you know, I've got, I had someone who could play the part for me if I was not ready. And, I had to learn how to dive too. You know, I myself didn't have to dive, but Felipe, who plays Victor, had to dive. So we took classes together.
Yeah, well, you guys make diving look real easy because I would be all kinds of panicked in like the depths of water that you guys have to be in. And you also make motorcycle looking really cool too.
Great to know that. That was the whole point. We wanted to look easy, but it was hard work.
Nice. Well, you guys definitely put in the work. Another thing about putting in the work I want to talk to you about is very interesting, this father-son dynamic. And I kind of want to get your thoughts on what you want parents to take from this relationship. And do you think Victor will ever give up on Pedro? Will he always be there for him?
I don't think so. I think he'll never give up on him. One of the main topics we try to discuss in the series is the fact that Victor has never given up on Pedro, and Pedro has never given up on his father either. That could also happen. That's a tough question to answer, let me tell you. Victor once said something that's quite emblematic. He says that it takes us a life to learn whether or not we have made mistakes. So when it comes to raising your children, there's no right or wrong. I mean, we do have an idea on what may work for our children and what may not. But we learn on a daily basis. We have to learn how to deal with our children, listen to them. It may sound obvious, but when you're a father, you only learn after the situations have gone by. But we have to be around our children, close to them. Victor feels guilty because he feels like he's an absent father. I mean, when my son got in touch with cocaine, if the father were there, would the situation be different? So if you can be close to your children, that's what you have to do. And I don't mean to be physically close to the person. Sometimes you can't be there, but you can be in touch. You can have often conversations. I mean, these are things that I learned from the series, but it's very hard to answer your question because, Victor had more than one child. Pedro went that way, but his daughter didn't. And the father was the same. So it makes you wonder.
Yeah, it does. It also makes you wonder too. And speaking of being that closeness and open as parents and open as fathers trying to figure it out, do you think it would have helped Pedro to know more about what his dad did and sort of more of the backstory of where his dad was going when he was on these like top secret missions and everything?
Well, possibly. I guess so. Things could have gone differently because he was a secret agent. He couldn't tell his child everything. So that sort of put a wall in between them. And since he was also an absent father, since there was no dialogue, since they couldn't talk about his work, I mean, had he known that his father was fighting these crimes, maybe he would see cocaine as something terrible and wouldn't get involved. So that's possible.
Yeah, because there was a lot of on your edge of your seat where you're like, man, if he just told them and let them know a little bit more, maybe it would have been different. Maybe he would have understood more of his father's background. But also on that as well, do you think there was a little side of Victor, that constantly chased after Pedro and constantly wanted to fix it because there was some of that in Victor, like seeing these leaders of these gangs where Victor was like, he got close to one at one point. Was there a little bit of that in Victor where he was really trying to prevent that in Pedro?
Well, I think when he gets close to this drug dealer, he had a clear mission. That happened back in the day when cocaine got into Rio de Janeiro. He wanted to be infiltrated to collect information and to prevent that from happening. So I think the main lesson here at this point, back in the day when he was young and when he got infiltrated into the mafia, is something that he says later on. He says that criminals and the police in Rio de Janeiro are alike. I mean, we can't generalize it, right? We got good police officers and bad ones, but what he was trying to say is that criminals cared for the community. They wanted to help the people around them, which is something that the police and the state, let me talk about the state, not the police. The state most of the times did not do that. So criminals had to stand up for their community to cater for their needs. So the question is that a legitimate claim? Who's more wrong, if we can say that? He commits crime to help those who are around them, or is it due to the state that is absent because of violence and ongoing corruption? So the fact that he got close to this drug dealer leader, I don't think it has anything to do with the fact that Pedro got in touch with them. The fact that he had a secret life may have had something to do with that. Now, since Victor was closer to drug dealers, he learned that they were criminals, but that they were also humans. That was very clear. And he tells Pedro that. He says that criminals and the police are not that different.
Yeah, and absolutely. And one of the last things I want to ask you, speaking on that, when you talk about there's this really emotional scene with Pedro and Victor in a hospital, and the doctor tries to call him an animal. And then just speaking of just Victor always going to bat, saying, "Look, you got to look at the other side. You have to know there's another human being on the side of this addiction that you see." Why was that? Was that a challenging scene for you to shoot, and how long did that take for you guys to film that?
Well, it was. It was a very challenging scene, and since we were studying it in the script when we were rehearsing, that scene was a very important scene for us because it was a very extreme scene of emotion, of violence, of course. There is some violence there, but that, well, Victor sometimes he cannot dialogue with, he has his own justifications, but I think that there was maybe lacking a dialogue with the physician, and the physician didn't have a dialogue with him. So really this demanded a lot of care. And once again, it is one of the key scenes of revelation of this feeling, of this love that the father and son had for one another. So this is one of the scenes that shows that Victor will do anything to save the son, to rescue the son, to bringing the son closer to him. So there were several things involved in that scene, not only what it meant, but the way that we were going to play it out. And we wanted to make the scene believable because it is a scene that we really talk about, that Breno mentions that it is a story based on real life, real facts. There is some fiction in the middle, but most of these scenes that are most absurd and that seem very distant from reality are the scenes that really took place. The scenes that Victor reported or were reported in the news. So these are the scenes that took place. Victor did that sort of thing. And so we realize, and Breno talked about this, it is difficult for the fiction to imitate real life sometimes.
Yeah, it is. And yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But and I just want to say thank you again, Flavio. This has been great. I was on the edge of my seat trying to figure out with you guys. It was so much passion on the screen, and you guys really did a good job. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Hey, Gabriel, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate your portrayal of Pedro. I know this because I could not determine whether I wanted to get up and scream sometimes or root for him because it was so many different layers to Pedro. I wanted to ask you on that note, on that note, how did you prepare for the emotional roller coaster that is Pedro? And when you were reading the script, were you like the fans where you're like, I can't believe he's going back again?
Yes, yes, sure. That also happened to me. I remember I received the screenplay for the two first episodes, then for the two next ones, and so forth. I mean, I knew the whole story. Breno, the director, had told me all about this story, but still, as I read the script, I felt the same. I was like, oh my God. Sometimes I was breathless. I was really tense and nervous. After reading the episodes, I was like, send me the next ones. I'm desperate to read them. And that was a great, great feeling. I knew this story previously and I was really interested. So I felt like that was great because the audience would also be interested in the story. I also think that, as you said, that is one of um, the greatest elements of this show. Pedro is really charismatic. He captivates us, but at the same time, he has to deal with his drug addiction. I mean, the whole point of the show was to, of course, root for him at different points, but we knew that at different points we would be sort of mad at him. We wanted the audience to try and fill his shoes at some times. What role did he play as a child in the family? So yeah, I'm happy to see that was your reaction. It's great that you also went through this great roller coaster.
Yeah, and let me tell you something else too. When you are a Dom fan or a Pedro fan, it's throwing me off right now that you don't have blonde hair. But what I thought was very interesting right now or the very interesting concept is the idea of colorism, especially, yeah, right, especially in this time period, right, of what's going on in the world, and the fact that a lot of the situation that Pedro was put in was because maybe his crew or somebody around him was like, well, you have blonde hair and blue eyes, so you can get in and do it. Doesn't necessarily mean he should be pushed in the situation, but that's what everybody was telling him. What was your mindset playing those roles? And even though you're in that character, hearing people say those kind of things to you?
Well, yeah, like you said, I'm not blonde. I'm not blue-eyed. So, still, that was a choice. Pedro was blonde. He had blue eyes. And, making me look like that was a choice because Pedro was seen as a stereotype of a white, rich man, who's blonde and who has blue eyes. He knew that, and he used that stereotype as a tool so that he could get into places and rob them. That makes us think, there is a lot of structural racism to our society currently. Unfortunately, if he were a black boy, it wouldn't be easy for him to enter all those facilities he entered. So Pedro used this as a tool. In Rio de Janeiro, he was known as the hot criminal because of the way he looked. So I think this is an essential debate. And the costume was essential in that regard. I mean, that is not something that is explicit to the show, but you just look at him and you see that his look opens many doors. So yeah, that's one of the discussions and reflections we want to bring upon the audience. Sure. We want
Yeah,
our audience to think about these provocative issues and
right.
structural racism and inequality in our society.
And also too, a lot of things that make you think about this character are his relationships. I know one that for me, Pedro and Lico, like that relationship. Was that something that threw you when you looked at the script? And do you feel like that was one of the major signs for Pedro where he was like, okay, I'm done trying to fix this. This is just who I am, and I'm gonna go full force into it because he just felt that guilt.
You know, I think the story is all about the father's perspective towards his son. After Pedro was murdered, his father looked for Breno, the director, and he wanted to tell his story about his son. According to his reports, Pedro was always in touch with his father. I mean, he was a wanted thief in Rio de Janeiro, but he was always in contact with his father. So he was aware of, you know, the wrongs that he did. And he knew that he did wrong to himself, to people around him, because of the crimes he committed, but also because of his drug addiction. Now, drug addiction is a disease, and he had to deal with that all throughout his life. So, aside from being a drug addict, he didn't feel physical pain, and that led him to look for dangerous situations so that he could feel that rush of adrenaline. So he was aware of that. He actually looked for dangerous situations, but at the same time, I'm not sure he was aware of how wrongful his actions were. But there was this snowball effect in his life. One thing led to another. He became ever more addicted. And then at a certain point, he was absolutely inside that new reality he couldn't get out of.
Yeah, absolutely. And just like you said, it's very powerful how you and the cast bring this to light, especially with the relationships around him. I'm going to shift here a little bit because I want to ask you about he spent a lot of time partying, a lot of time on the funk parties. Are you guys' playlists syncing up now? You guys have the same taste in music?
Well, those scenes were the coolest ones to shoot. You know, I'd never been to funk parties, but when I was younger, there was this TV show that was all about funk parties, and I used to watch that at lunchtime. So it was great to be there, and live that new reality. It was quite fun and very interesting. I was never very keen of funk. I never liked the Brazilian type of funk because funk you see on the show reminds me of some songs I used to like in the past. But if you ask me, I prefer the American type of funk, James Brown and his crew, that's the type of music I like.
Oh yes, you cannot go wrong with James Brown. Absolutely, James Brown. Listen, again, as we kind of wrap here, I so love your performance here. I want to kind of wrap with asking you about what do you hope, I guess, even young people, different generations of people take away from watching Pedro, and what were some of the, without spoiling too much, I guess, of the outcome of Pedro, what was your reaction to seeing that last script, that last scene?
I think that this series is all about dialogue. The show is all about connecting with new generations and with their parents too. This project was something Pedro's father started. Victor gave our director an interview, and it's also available in Amazon's X-Ray, I guess. During this interview, he says that he doesn't want to tell his story because his son died. I mean, he says, my son died, I'm going to die, everyone is going to die one day. I just wanted to tell you my story about my child because our lives were so contrasting so that other families and other people can relate with this story and reflect upon it. So I think the show is all about not being judgmental. We don't want to find out who's to blame. Parents are not to blame. Children are not to blame. We're talking about many elements that factor into the whole process. We're talking about parents' attitudes and children's attitudes. You know, at a certain point, these children were young folks, but after some time they grew up and they became young adults. So they're also accountable for their actions. That's what we don't want to do in the show. We do not want to point fingers. We just want to bring about these important discussions regarding families, I guess. You know, as I performed on the show, that's what I felt. My parents watched the show and they felt the same way. So that's what I can tell you. I expect children and parents can connect, may feel the series and reflect about all the issues that we're talking about. Because after all, this show was based on a true story. So most of the things that you're going to watch actually happened.
Yeah, you will definitely reflect. I definitely hope fans go out and check these 8 episodes out. It will have you on that emotional roller coaster. So good. Thank you so much, Gabriel, again for your time.
Thank you.
All right. Hey, Brenda, how you doing? Thanks for talking with me.
It's my pleasure.
So what happened? What went through your mind when you found out you're going to be the first scripted Brazilian series on Amazon Prime? That's crazy. That's so cool.
Well, actually, it's my second show, but I think that Dom goes really beyond everything. I think the story is so clean, it's so different, so profound, really, at the same time that I think it is really different from everything else that I've done.
And this is such such an interesting crime drama dealing with a father and son. Where did you come up with the idea, or just being brave enough to put some of this realness in parents and kids and having to understand each other on Amazon Prime like this?
Well, the story starts a long time ago, actually in this very room where I'm sitting right here. Victor, 12 years ago, he came into this room. He was very emotional that day. He wanted to tell me about his story and his child, and he said this needs to be, shown to everyone. So it was a long project. I tried to understand everything that he went through. It was difficult. He wasn't an easy person, but I noticed that I had in my hands something that was very humane, something that was very interesting. There are so many shows talking about drugs and violence, but here we're talking about a different perspective. This perspective where you see drugs like entering a home and you understand what happens in that home. And you have very different characters, of course, because Victor is that person that spent his whole life, combating drugs. And then when he told me all that, it took me a while to believe in the story. And then I noticed that it was very interesting. I said, in the beginning, I said, no, this is crazy. It's not true. But then little by little, I understood that it was true indeed. And I understood the story with his child. I remember when I was young, I would see Dom in the news. I really remember that from my youth. I remember like him being on the news constantly. And then I noticed that it was real and that there was a lot of drama, family drama as well involved. So this show, it mixes so many genres. Sometimes you have adrenaline, sometimes you're crying. So that's interesting to me. You know, you're trying to provoke this reaction in the audience. So every time I do that, I am very happy because it is connected to my DNA, really.
Yeah, and speaking of the adrenaline and the drama, what also pushes the setting, being in Rio de Janeiro in the favelas. Can you kind of talk about a little bit about that, of picking that setting and talking about these communities that were really dependent on these crime leaders of these mob bosses to make it through?
Well, yes. What I like to show in the series is that when I met Victor, he was one of the people who had really seen the transition, the transformation in the favelas. Back in the 70s, he started going to the favelas, and at the time it was basically minor drugs, samba, a little bit of violence. But when cocaine entered, after marijuana, then cocaine brought a lot of corruption. It was a completely different thing. And then you start to understand the changes in Rio de Janeiro, because you see, it is a unique city. It is a place where the favelas are there, close to other rich neighborhoods. In around 3 kilometers, you have like one community, then you go through the rich buildings, and then you get to the bourgeoisie, really, of the beach. So Rio de Janeiro has this unique characteristic, I would say. It's different from other cities in the world. Everything is side by side, I would say, which is okay in a way. I mean, this is an interesting exchange, which leads to what Rio is. But filming there is not simple at all. It's really not simple. So you have to investigate, you have to research, you have to talk to people, you have to try and understand in which favelas you can actually enter. There is one favela that was built on top of this mountain in the 70s, and that doesn't exist anymore nowadays. It's now made of cement. It's a lot of funk, the music, and a lot of graffiti. But back in the day, it was different. You had even, I don't know, banana trees. It was completely different from nowadays. So we had to try and build that back to what it looked like in the past. And we had to do that in one of the locations. And in the other case, we had more of a friendly favela, and it was easier to shoot. But of course, in many occasions, we had to stop shooting because there was a conflict with, I don't know, the police, or sometimes it would be a little bit more difficult. I don't think there's anything like filming in real locations. I love filming in real locations because you have that warmth, you have that power of interpretation when you do that. You have like the real walls of the place. I really hate studios. I think it's fake. So I think one of the nice things in the show is that reality that comes through the lenses. So we had to film at a real favela.
Yeah, you can tell it too, because the very tense situations, and especially if they're in the little closed areas, and Pedro is very uncomfortable going down these streets sometimes, or if he's get ready to fight with somebody, you're like, how are they shooting in this tight little area between these buildings? Do you have like a favorite scene, favorite moment that you're like, okay, this has to get in here, we have to show this?
Well, I think there are many favorite scenes, but I do remember one that was very difficult, which was the scene where the boy has an overdose in the street. I don't know if you've seen it. He has this overdose, and we didn't have authorization to film in the street, actually. So I said, let's do it either way. Let's just go and try. And then we went with the cameras. There was this car, and he was starting the overdose, and the whole team was there. People would go along and say, what is happening? And then he started to have like this seizure, and people were gathering around. So at the end, it was very emotional, I think, because since we did it, we just went there and did it at once, it was very impactful, I would say. For me, it is something that makes me very emotional when I watch it nowadays. And there were so many other complicated scenes. Even the first one, it was super complicated when he shoots, in the middle of everyone. There were 600 people involved. And then you're there late night in the community, in the favela, and there are some people who are there who actually know that reality, are in that reality, but some others are not, and it's difficult controlling so many people in the film set. So I would say it's very explosive. You have to try and make sure that looks real, but at the same time, you have to keep it under control to not make a bomb out of it. So imagine Spike Lee, where he suffers really because it's difficult. It's difficult to bring all that pressure to the scenes, to have that tension. But people might get too excited. It could be uncontrollable.
Yeah, you guys definitely had to control some of those scenes. That's what had me on the edge of the edge of my seat. And speaking of which, like the last question I got for you with Pedro, he's one of those characters that you can never sit comfortable because there were so many cool layers to him, so many things you had to figure out about him. With the way that it ended, not to spoil it for anybody, do we have a second part to that? Because it was very like undercover operative mixed with the mob boss. It was a lot of layers thrown at us at the end there.
Well, one of the things that I found interesting about this story is that I noticed that both Victor and Pedro, they did have many layers. The layer of love, the layer of adrenaline that, pulls them together. There's also at the same time danger involved. So there are good characters for this show where you try to show different layers little by little. You go back to childhood, you try to make people understand why that happened. So what's interesting for the audience is that in the beginning, they don't really have anything to like them, either of them. One is a failed cop, the other is a criminal. People say, oh, why would I like them? But as you see the different layers, as you peel them, you start to see a different perspective. And well, I hope this continues. I really hope Amazon is going to tell me that we're going to have another season because there's so much to tell.
I hope so too, Bruno. I'm crossing my fingers because I wanted to know. I was like, I just love how it ended, and I was on my seat all the way, and I was pulling for Pedro. He had me mad a couple times and happy the other time, so I really appreciate it. Thank you guys so much for all the work.
Thank you so much, Ryanne.
Thank you. Again, Antonio, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate your time because the soundtrack for this one was very intense because of the subject matter. There was always that somber beat underneath. But I want to start by asking you, you've done the whole City of God, Lord of War, very interesting projects. Do these projects find you, or do you have something that you look for when you select these projects?
Well, there's two main things. I think the story is amazing. It's a real story, and it's I may say it's some sort of a brother of City of God, but also not, because this one has a love relationship between these two characters, a father that wants to save the son and things like that. So yeah, I forgot the question.
I probably offloaded a lot at one time, but I'm just curious. Do you look for, because there's so cool bodies of work and just so interesting how you have to put the music together for these projects. Do they find you, or do you have certain things that you look for, like, hey, I want to take this project on?
Look, until this day, they find me. I mostly because I've been very lucky. I'm always working, so there's no time for. I have an agent, of course, but there's no time for us to look for things. They mostly come to me. I'm very lucky because I have worked with so many amazing directors and amazing projects. So I think I'm lucky. I may say that.
Now, with the connection to Rio de Janeiro, was there extra pressure for this project to make sure you got everything just right, or was it more of a kind of relax and the feel and the vibe?
Well, I was born in Rio, right? So I know Rio very much, and I'm not that young. I wish I were, but I'm not. So I know deeply about Rio, and I know about this closeness of very rich people and very poor people living very close to each other. And when I say very poor people, I say really, really poor people and really, really rich people living in this small area, because Rio, it's full of mountains and everything is tight. So there's this interesting relationship between the two classes. So, and also for me, I feel very comfortable to work with that, because it is as if I'm telling a story that I've been watching for my whole life. And Rio also has a very musical story. You know, most of the Brazilian music known all over the world was born in Rio too. So I think, yeah, that's. No, I'm not. I think I'm at home when I do that.
Now, was it speaking of like the generational gap you're talking about here with a father and son, was there times where it was a little bit difficult for you to bring in, like, say, I'm gonna be in millennial category, or millennial, like the different tracks to bring up, a different beat, and you're talking about, Rio at a certain time now, and what people are listening to now, what would catch their ear?
Well, yeah, I do research of music at a time, but as I said, I lived the time, so for me it's a comfortable place. And the other thing is that I have sons. I have 3 sons, and they are the
There you
same age.
go.
So it's also something that I really know. I would say,
And
yeah.
also, too, I'm so curious about this process that you have as a composer when you pick a project. How do you know what instruments, what beats? How do you know it's going to fit when you first put it together?
Well, I will tell you, for example, City of God. When I've watched the first 20 minutes of it, and I was coming from another film that I've just done that was really orchestral. There was a lot of strings. It was really emotional and things like that. When I watched City of God, the first impression that I had is that the film was so good and it was so ready that I had to be very careful with the music, not to spoil the film, for example. And then I thought, the first thing that I thought, it was, this film has no strings at all. There's no emotional. And because it was set in a certain time, like it has three different ages, the film. It's the beginning of the 60s, middle of the 60s, and the 70s and middle of the 70s. So the music in Rio was like, at the 60s, it was mostly samba. We call it root samba. And on the 70s, the funk came to Brazil. So it was this funk parties, big funk parties and the funk started to blend with samba. So the idea that I had, I said, I'm going to do this film as the music is playing there. And so the first part is traditional samba, the second part is funk samba, and the third part of the film was war. And the film becomes dark. And the film is like, the beginning, the film is warm. On the 17th, the photography, it's cold. And on the war, everything is dark. Yes. So I get the samba, and I put the samba very low tones, very slow timing. So this is some sort of like an idea for that. So for Dom, the idea was different, because it was the emotional, there's darkness, but there was the emotional journey of these two characters. So, and also the director wanted to have strings. So this is the main, and then we blended strings with electronic music, with very rough and acoustic instruments, acoustic percussion also. So that's the idea. I wanted to tell you that I wrote the music for this show with another guy that used to be my assistant, and now is an amazing composer called Gabriel Ferreira, just so you know.
Yeah, see, well, we got to give him credit too, because it was just amazing knowing Pedro's story, or kind of following Pedro, and then you would get to the credits, or you would get to a scene where you had hope for Pedro, and then that samba, the tone that you're talking about, where it drops, would really hit you, would really hit the audience. and you're like, okay, well now my whole mood is just all the way like, do we still have hope for Pedro? You know, is he going to make it to the next episode? You know, music brings all that out in you. Is that one of the things that you love about being a composer for so many of these projects?
Yeah, I was telling this day, I was talking to this other guy, and that we, as a musician, as a composer, I'm not only a musician. I'm a filmmaker with the director, with the DP, with the photographer, with the writers. So I really love to do music to tell a story. Either you go against the scene, or you go towards the scene, and to learn how to give you the story without overwhelming the music, and the music to be perfect for the story. And also, as a composer, as a musician, I want the music to be good, you know.
Right, exactly.
And I want the music to be different too, so to be fresh, to have interesting sounds and things like that, you know.
But yeah, it was very interesting. Had me on my seat. Loved every minute of it. Can't wait to see if there's an album coming out for it. But I wanted to ask you, kind of to wrap up here, what are you taking away from this project? There are so many themes and so much emotion within this project. What are you taking away from, or you hope audience take away from listening to your beautiful tracks?
Well, I hope, of course, everybody loves it. As I was saying, it's one of the first Amazon series, Brazilian series that Amazon is taking really good care of it. It's really interested on the story. It's doing a huge marketing all over the world. So what I take is that I want to congratulate everybody who done it, because it's a great series, and also to be honored and emotionally overwhelmed with the fact that we are going everywhere now with something that we've done it with so much love.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it definitely translates through cultures, different cultures. So Antonio, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ryanne. Thank you.
Thank you.
Better shake your booties for black girl nerves. Better shake your booties for black girl nerves.